The incident. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Harrison Military Base as Sergeant Mark Thompson walked through the administration building. His boots echoed against the polished floors, each step reflecting the discipline that had been drilled into him over 8 years of service. He carried himself with the confidence of a decorated soldier, someone who had earned respect through countless missions and unwavering dedication to his country. Sarah Martinez had been working at the base for 3 years as a civilian contractor. Her job involved managing supply chains and coordinating between different departments. She was known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to solve problems that others found impossible. That morning, she sat at her desk reviewing inventory reports when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The numbers didn't add up. Medical supplies worth thousands of dollars were missing from the latest shipment. Sarah had double-checked everything multiple times, but the conclusion remained the same. Someone had been stealing from the military supplies, and the pattern suggested it wasn't a one-time occurrence. Sarah knew she had to report this immediately. Military protocol was clear about such matters, and her civilian contractor training had emphasized the importance of transparency in all operations. She gathered her files and headed toward the security office, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had discovered. Sergeant Thompson was coming around the corner when Sarah approached him in the hallway. She had worked with him before on various supply coordination matters, and he had always been professional, though somewhat intimidating. Sarah took a deep breath and decided to inform him about her findings before going to security. "Sergeant Thompson," she called out, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I need to speak with you about something urgent regarding the medical supplies." Thompson stopped and turned toward her, his expression neutral but attentive. "What about them, Martinez?" Sarah explained what she had discovered, showing him the paperwork that clearly indicated the discrepancies. As she spoke, she noticed Thompson's expression changing. His jaw tightened, and his eyes grew cold. When she finished explaining, there was a moment of heavy silence. "You're making serious accusations," Thompson said, his voice low and threatening. "Are you absolutely certain about these numbers?" Sarah nodded firmly. "I've checked everything 3 times. The evidence is clear. We need to report this to the appropriate authorities immediately. What happened next would change everything." Thompson's face flushed red with anger, and he stepped closer to Sarah. His military training had taught him to maintain composure under pressure, but something about this situation triggered a violent response that he would later struggle to explain. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snarled, raising his hand. The blow came without warning. Thompson's fist connected with the side of Sarah's head with brutal force. The impact sent her stumbling backward, and she crashed into the wall behind her. The sound of her head hitting the concrete echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot. Sarah collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Blood began to pool beneath her head where it had struck the wall. Thompson stood over her, breathing heavily, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what he had done. His military career, his reputation, his entire life could be destroyed by this single moment of violence. Panic set in as Thompson looked around the empty hallway. He had to think quickly. He knelt beside Sarah and checked for a pulse, relieved to find that she was still breathing, though unconscious. The blood was concerning, but she was alive. Thompson's mind raced through his options. He could call for medical help and claim she had fallen, but the evidence might not support that story. He could report the incident truthfully, but that would mean facing court-martial and the end of everything he had worked for. Or he could try to cover it up somehow, though he wasn't sure how. The weight of his decision pressed down on him as he looked at Sarah's motionless form. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the consequences were beginning to sink in. His hands shook as he realized that this moment would define the rest of his life. Minutes passed as Thompson tried to process what had happened. He had always prided himself on his self-control and discipline, but something about Sarah's discovery had triggered a response that went against everything he stood for as a soldier. The irony wasn't lost on him that his violent reaction might have just confirmed her suspicions about wrongdoing on the base. Thompson finally made his decision. He would call for medical help and claim that Sarah had slipped and fallen. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only option that might save his career. He pulled out his radio and prepared to make the call that would set everything in motion. As he reached for his communication device, Thompson heard footsteps approaching from around the corner. His heart stopped as he realized someone was coming. There would be no time to stage the scene or prepare his story. Someone was about to discover him standing over Sarah's unconscious body, and there would be no explaining this away. The footsteps grew louder, and Thompson knew his fate was sealed. Whatever happened next would be completely out of his control. He had gambled everything on a moment of violence, and now he was about to face the consequences. The sound of approaching voices made it clear that multiple people were coming. Thompson's military training kicked in, and he forced himself to stand at attention, knowing that running would only make things worse. He would face whatever came next, with whatever dignity he could muster. But nothing could have prepared him for who was about to round that corner. The approaching footsteps belonged to some of the most powerful people on the entire base, and their discovery of this scene would trigger a chain of events that would shock everyone involved. Thompson closed his eyes and took a deep breath, knowing that his life as he knew it was about to end. The next few minutes would determine not only his future, but potentially the fate of the entire base. The magnitude of what he had done was about to become clear, and there would be no going back. The discovery. The three men who rounded the corner wore stars on their uniforms that commanded immediate respect and fear. General Robert Hayes, the base commander, led the group with his characteristic stern expression. Behind him walked General Patricia Williams, the regional operations commander, and General Michael Chen, who oversaw military intelligence for the entire district. Their unexpected presence in this administrative hallway was unusual enough, but what they were about to witness would change everything. General Hayes stopped abruptly when he saw the scene before him. Sergeant Thompson stood rigidly at attention next to Sarah Martinez's unconscious form, blood pooling around her head. The three generals took in the situation with the practiced eyes of military leaders who had seen combat and crisis management throughout their careers. "What happened here, Sergeant?" General Hayes demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Thompson's throat felt dry as he struggled to find words. His prepared story about Sarah falling seemed ridiculous in the face of three generals who had collectively decades of experience reading people and situations. These weren't junior officers he could potentially mislead. These were the most senior commanders on the base. "Sir, there was an incident," Thompson began, his voice barely steady. "Ms. Martinez was discussing some concerns about supply discrepancies, and then she what, Sergeant?" General Williams interrupted, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. She had spent years in military intelligence before her promotion, and nothing about this situation looked accidental to her trained observation. General Chen was already kneeling beside Sarah, checking her pulse and examining her injuries with the medical training all senior officers received. His expression grew increasingly grim as he assessed the damage. "This isn't from a fall," he said quietly to the other generals. "The impact pattern is consistent with assault." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Thompson felt his world crashing down around him as the three most powerful people on the base processed what had really happened. His military career was over, but he was beginning to realize that might be the least of his problems. General Hayes stepped closer to Thompson, his eyes boring into the sergeant's soul. "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer. What exactly happened to Ms. Martinez?" The pressure of the moment broke Thompson's resolve. Years of military conditioning told him to tell the truth to superior officers, even when that truth would destroy him. "I struck her, sir," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "She was making accusations about missing supplies, and I lost control." The three generals exchanged glances that spoke volumes. This wasn't just about assault on a civilian contractor. The mention of missing supplies had triggered something much more significant. General Williams pulled out her secure communication device and stepped away to make a call that Thompson couldn't hear. General Chen continued his examination of Sarah while calling for medical personnel on his radio. "We need an ambulance and a medical team to the administration building immediately," he said with urgency. "Civilian contractor down with head trauma." General Hayes remained focused on Thompson, but his expression had shifted from anger to something much more complex. "Sergeant, you're under immediate arrest for assault. But before we proceed, I need you to tell me everything Ms. Martinez said about these supply discrepancies." Thompson realized he was trapped between two disasters. Admitting to the assault was one thing, but discussing the supply issues might implicate him in something even worse. However, refusing to answer direct questions from a three-star general would only make his situation more desperate. "She showed me inventory reports," Thompson said carefully. "Medical supplies that were supposed to arrive but weren't properly accounted for. She said the numbers suggested ongoing theft." The general's reactions told Thompson that his worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't just about his violent outburst. The supply chain issues were apparently part of something much larger that had already caught the attention of the highest levels of command. General Williams returned from her call with an expression that made everyone nervous. "The situation is being elevated to the Pentagon," she announced. "This base is now under Security Protocol 7. Thompson had never heard of Security Protocol 7, but the way the generals responded told him it was serious. General Chen immediately began coordinating additional security measures, while General Hayes continued his questioning. "How long have you been aware of these supply issues?" Hayes demanded. "I wasn't aware of them until today," Thompson insisted. "Ms. Martinez approached me this morning. It was the first I'd heard of any problems." General Williams studied Thompson's face carefully. "Your reaction suggests otherwise, Sergeant. People don't typically respond with violence to news they're hearing for the first time." The medical team arrived and immediately began treating Sarah. The paramedics worked efficiently while the generals continued their impromptu interrogation. Thompson watched helplessly as Sarah was loaded onto a stretcher, knowing that her condition would determine how severe his legal troubles would become. General Chen approached Thompson with a tablet displaying what appeared to be surveillance footage. "Sergeant, we've been monitoring certain activities on this base for several weeks. Your name has appeared in our investigation multiple times." The revelation hit Thompson like a physical blow. He had assumed his activities had gone unnoticed, but apparently military intelligence had been tracking the supply chain irregularities for some time. His attack on Sarah hadn't just been witnessed by three generals. It had potentially blown apart an ongoing investigation. "We know about the medical supplies," General Williams said quietly. "We know about the pharmaceutical diversions. What we didn't know was who was ultimately responsible." "Your reaction today suggests we may have found our answer." Thompson's mind raced as he tried to process this new information. The investigation was apparently much broader than he had realized, and his violent response to Sarah's discovery had just made him the prime suspect in a military criminal enterprise that reached far beyond simple theft. General Hayes made another call on his secure device, speaking in low tones that Thompson couldn't understand. When he finished, he turned back to the group with an expression of grim determination. "Effective immediately. This base is under lockdown," Hayes announced. "No one enters or leaves without direct authorization from myself or General Williams." "Sergeant Thompson, you're being transferred to military detention pending a full investigation." As military police arrived to escort Thompson away, he realized that his moment of violence had triggered something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The three generals weren't just dealing with an assault case. They were managing a crisis that threatened the security and integrity of the entire military installation. The sound of additional vehicles arriving outside indicated that reinforcements were being brought in. Thompson's attack on Sarah had inadvertently exposed a network of criminal activity that the Pentagon was taking very seriously indeed. The investigation. Within hours of Thompson's arrest, Fort Harrison had transformed into something resembling a maximum security prison. Military police units from 3 different bases had arrived to secure the perimeter. Nobody was allowed to leave, and all communications were being monitored. The 3 generals had effectively locked down an entire military installation based on what they had witnessed in that hallway. General Hayes established a command center in the base's conference room, where he coordinated with Pentagon officials who were flying in to take control of the investigation. The assault on Sarah Martinez had been the trigger, but it had exposed something much more sinister that had been operating under their noses for months. Sarah regained consciousness in the base hospital 12 hours after the attack. Her head injury was serious but not life-threatening, though doctors were monitoring her for signs of concussion and brain trauma. When she was finally able to speak clearly, her first words were about the missing supplies she had discovered. "The medical inventory," she whispered to the nurse attending her. "Someone needs to know about the discrepancies." General Williams was notified immediately and came to Sarah's bedside with a digital recorder and a military lawyer. What Sarah revealed during that interview would validate everything the generals had suspected and more. "I first noticed problems 3 months ago," Sarah explained, her voice still weak from her injuries. "Small amounts at first, mostly pain medications and antibiotics. But when I started tracking the patterns, I realized it was systematic. Sarah's investigation had been far more thorough than anyone realized. She had been documenting the theft for months, building a case that she planned to present to base security. Her files contained evidence of a criminal network that extended beyond Fort Harrison to several other military installations. "I identified at least 6 people involved," Sarah continued. "Sergeant Thompson was one of them, but he wasn't the leader. Someone with higher clearance was coordinating everything." General Chen reviewed Sarah's evidence with growing alarm. The scope of the operation was staggering. Medical supplies worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had been systematically stolen and sold on the black market. The implications for military readiness and national security were enormous. In the detention facility, Thompson was undergoing intensive interrogation by military intelligence specialists. His assault on Sarah had destroyed any leverage he might have had, and investigators were using his desperate situation to extract information about the larger conspiracy. "You're looking at life in military prison for assaulting a civilian," the lead investigator told Thompson. "Your only hope is full cooperation with this investigation." Thompson's story emerged slowly over several sessions. He had been recruited into the theft ring by a senior officer who promised easy money for minimal risk. What had started as stealing small amounts of supplies had gradually escalated into a sophisticated operation involving multiple bases and civilian contacts. "Major Richard Kovac was running everything," Thompson finally admitted. "He said we were just redistributing surplus supplies that would otherwise expire. He made it sound like we were actually helping people who needed medication." Major Kovac was arrested within hours of Thompson's confession. His quarters were searched, revealing evidence of communications with civilian drug dealers and detailed records of the theft operation. The major had been using his position to coordinate supply diversions across multiple military facilities. The investigation expanded rapidly as more evidence emerged. Federal agents joined the military investigators, and the scope of the criminal enterprise shocked everyone involved. The theft ring had been operating for over 2 years, stealing millions of dollars worth of medical supplies from military installations across 3 states. General Hayes coordinated with Pentagon officials as the investigation revealed connections to organized crime groups who were buying the stolen supplies. The medical materials were being sold to illegal clinics and drug dealers, creating a national security crisis that went far beyond simple theft. This could have compromised military medical readiness during a crisis, General Williams reported to her superiors. If we had faced a major emergency, our medical supplies might not have been adequate to handle casualties. Sarah's recovery became a priority not just for humanitarian reasons, but because her testimony would be crucial to prosecuting the entire criminal network. The attack that had nearly killed her had inadvertently exposed one of the largest military corruption cases in recent history. 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah was released from the hospital and placed in protective custody while the investigation continued. Her meticulous documentation had provided investigators with a roadmap to unravel the entire operation, and her courage in reporting the discrepancies despite the personal risk had prevented an even larger crisis. Thompson accepted a plea agreement that would result in a lengthy prison sentence in exchange for his continued cooperation. His moment of violence had destroyed his life, but it had also helped expose a criminal conspiracy that threatened military security. Major Kovac and 14 other military personnel were eventually charged in connection with the theft ring. The civilian dealers who had been purchasing the stolen supplies faced federal drug trafficking charges. The entire network was dismantled within 6 months of Thompson's attack on Sarah. General Hayes implemented new security protocols for supply chain management across all installations under his command. The incident had revealed dangerous vulnerabilities in military logistics that needed immediate attention. Sarah eventually returned to work at a different military installation, where she was promoted to oversee supply chain security for the entire region. Her experience at Fort Harrison had made her one of the military's leading experts on preventing internal theft and corruption. The base lockdown was lifted after 3 weeks, but Fort Harrison never returned to normal. The incident had shattered trust within the military community and led to comprehensive reforms in how military supplies were tracked and secured. Thompson's violent reaction to Sarah's discovery had been intended to silence her and protect his criminal activities. Instead, it had triggered the largest military corruption investigation in decades and resulted in his own downfall. The irony was not lost on investigators who noted that his attempt to cover up the crime had actually ensured its exposure. Years later, Sarah would reflect on how a single morning's work reviewing inventory reports had led to such dramatic consequences. Her commitment to doing her job honestly and reporting wrongdoing had nearly cost her life, but it had ultimately served the greater good by protecting military resources and national security. The case became a cautionary tale within military circles about the importance of integrity and the dangers of corruption. Thompson's assault on Sarah had lasted only seconds, but its consequences had reshaped an entire military installation and led to reforms that would affect military operations for years to come.